The state is me. I am the state. Has God forgotten all I have done for him?
Hey guys, tonight we will push open the heavy doors of Versailles and step into a chamber where the flickering candlelight is not enough to chase away the haunting stench clinging to every stone.
This
Upon that
country
gilded
is
bed
mine.
no longer lies the glorious Sunday king, but a form rotting away hour by hour, still clinging to royal rituals as if they could hold back the approach
Why do
of
you
death.
weep?
You will see that even the one
Did
who
you
once
think
held
me
all of
immortal?
Europe in his hands cannot escape the common sentence of humanity. Tonight, I will take you to witness with your own eyes the details that history books trembled to omit. But trust me, if you have a faint heart, you will not survive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And do not forget to leave a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is where you live. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Louis the Fourteenth, the legendary King of France, known throughout the world by the illustrious title, the Sun King, had once been the living embodiment of absolute power. Throughout his life, he constantly asserted that he was chosen by God to rule over mankind. The earthly manifestation of divine will, people believed that his mere presence could light up an entire room with the aura of majesty and authority radiating from every gesture and word. To his subjects and to neighboring nations alike, he was not just a king, but the very center of a universe of power, the point toward which every gaze must turn. Yet, the relentless turning of time eventually arrived. In the final days of his life, all that dazzling glory crumbled, leaving nothing but a fragile shell. Louis the Fourteenth, once the symbol of immortality and sacred authority, had now become a living testament to an unavoidable truth. Even the most powerful are nothing more than flesh and bone, slowly rotting away and awaiting the end. This was not merely the tragedy of one man, but the collapse of an entire ideology that had existed for centuries. The belief that the king was divinely protected, a being beyond the natural cycle of life and death. This story, if viewed only through the veneer of ceremony and the gilded pages of history, might be distorted or left incomplete. Yet, what truly happened, with all its grotesque and unvarnished details, was something the royal historians deliberately concealed at all costs. They feared that this truth would shake the very foundations of absolute monarchy and destroy the image of the Sun King that all of Europe had revered. For 72 years of reign, one of the longest in history, Louis the Fourteenth transformed France from a feudal medieval kingdom into one of Europe's leading powers. He was the architect of the magnificent palace of Versailles, which served not only as a residence but as a symbol of power, displaying wealth and influence far beyond the country's borders. Every stone, every mirror, every garden in Versailles was arranged to remind all that the king was the center of all things, the source of light illuminating the entire nation. He skillfully crafted his image as a monarch directly empowered by God, commanding the respect and submission of the entire continent. However, by the year 1715, at the age of 76, Louis the Fourteenth was no longer the man standing in the eternal glow of his own grandeur. He had witnessed, one after another, the deaths of his son, his grandson, and nearly all his contemporaries, those who had once shared with him the victories, the power, and even the lavish banquets, had all departed. He stood as the last living witness to a fading era, a golden age he himself had built. Now, on the brink of vanishing into history, France itself was vastly different from the days of his youth. The glow of triumph and prosperity had been replaced by deep scars from decades of continuous wars fought to expand territory and consolidate power. The national treasury was nearly empty, drained after endless conflicts with many European nations. The country was shrouded in hardship. Successive harsh winters had destroyed crops, causing widespread famine, leaving streets filled with the gaunt and desperate. The nobility, once proud to serve at the court of Versailles, were now weary of the elaborate and restrictive court ceremonies that the king still insisted on maintaining as in the days of his peak authority. Every gesture, every audience, every ritual of greeting, bowing, and exchanging glances seemed to have become hollow repetitions. Stripped of their original meaning, they no longer came out of loyalty or reverence, but out of ingrained obligation or the need to preserve their positions in society. Versailles, which had once overwhelmed foreign visitors with its splendor and vitality, was now nothing more than a magnificent yet empty stage. The grand balls had become rare. The music and dancing faded, replaced by the subdued murmur of polite conversation and the weary steps echoing across marble floors. The courtiers, most of them aged, still dressed in elaborate finery and followed the daily ceremonial routines. But it was as if they were performing an old play with no true audience left to believe in what they saw. And at the center of this stage stood Louis the Fourteenth, no longer the proud young monarch with a piercing gaze, but a figure slowly becoming more like a living monument than a true ruler. His outward appearance was still meticulously maintained, and he still presented himself before the court in full ceremony. But behind that glittering facade, time had begun to carve cracks that could not be hidden, and no one then could have imagined that, in just a short time, these cracks would split open into a nightmarish picture, one that no one in the court, and perhaps in all of France, was prepared to face, despite his body beginning to weaken and the nation sinking deeper into debt and discontent. Louis the Fourteenth remained determined to maintain the rigid schedule of ceremonies that had been tied to his reign for decades. Each morning, he still performed the lever, the ritual of dressing in front of a carefully selected group of nobles. This was not merely the act of putting on clothes, but a performance of power in which every movement of the king was predetermined. From the moment he sat up in bed to the instant he donned his full ceremonial attire, each evening, he continued to receive envoys from neighboring countries and listen to petitions from his people, preserving the image of a monarch whose words still carried the weight they once had in his golden years. However, the reality had long since changed. Louis the Fourteenth's true power was no longer absolute. Most major decisions had fallen into the hands of trusted ministers, who governed the country according to their own calculations. Military commanders acted with increasing independence, at times disregarding the king's direct opinion. Meanwhile, the nobility, once wary of his authority, had begun to whisper among themselves about what might happen after the king's death. This atmosphere was like an undercurrent. No one dared speak openly, but everyone could feel it clearly. In the summer of 1715, those closest to Louis noticed changes that could not be ignored. His once imposing figure, which had commanded silence in the grand halls of Versailles when he entered, now seemed to shrink. The ornate garments that had once enhanced his regal presence now appeared to swallow the man within. This transformation was not merely a sign of age. It suggested that the king was slowly disappearing within his own form. His appetite, once legendary throughout Europe, had noticeably diminished. Lavish banquets with dozens of exquisite dishes became awkward affairs, as the king would only lift his spoon or fork with disinterest, nudging the food lightly, as though to maintain etiquette rather than from any desire to eat. The lively sounds of feasts had lost their cheer, replaced by a heavy atmosphere in which everyone pretended that nothing had changed. The changes did not stop at the physical. Louis the Fourteenth's mind also began to show troubling signs. The man who had once dominated every room with his presence, who had compelled his ministers to hang on his every word, now often stared blankly into space. On many occasions, he repeated himself as if he had forgotten what he had just said. In important meetings discussing matters of national destiny, The king often lost focus, his gaze drifting as though carried away by thoughts elsewhere. The royal physicians, accustomed to treating minor pains, light ailments, or carrying out ceremonial medical duties, now began to feel uneasy. They spoke to one another in hushed tones about the possibility of bringing in skilled doctors from Paris to examine the king, yet none of them dared to tell Louis the Fourteenth outright that his condition might be a sign of something serious. A fear that was both personal and political kept them silent, clinging to the hope that it was nothing more than temporary fatigue. In those days, Versailles still ran to its old rhythm: the morning lever, evening receptions, banquets, and court meetings. But behind the glittering facade, those perceptive enough saw the truth. The king was changing, no longer the immutable figure they had once believed in. And this change, though gradual, carried with it a vague sense of unease, as though it heralded an approaching storm, the severity of which no one yet knew. The first clear sign emerged in late July of the year 1715, when Louis the Fourteenth began to complain of pain in his left leg. At first, both he and his royal physicians believed it to be nothing more than a minor injury caused by too much walking during the endless ceremonies of court life. At the age of 76, a few aches and pains were to be expected, and no one thought it unusual. But this particular pain was different, sharp, persistent, and steadily worsening despite treatment. The king's chief physician, Guy Crescent Fagon, applied the traditional remedies of the time: bloodletting to drain supposed impurities, purges to cleanse the body, and poultices made of various herbs to soothe the affected area. These methods had, in the past, proved sufficient for minor ailments, but this time they did nothing to relieve the king's suffering. If anything, they seemed to sap his strength further, leaving him more irritable and short-tempered than before. By the time August arrived, the pain had grown so severe that Louis the Fourteenth could hardly walk. Even with the aid of a cane and the discreet support of his valet or guards, what had once been a graceful and commanding stride became a laboured, uneven movement. Every step, a visible effort. The elaborate ceremonies that had defined his reign for more than 7 decades began to weigh heavily upon him. Standing for long periods or crossing the vast marble halls of Versailles was now a test of endurance. Yet, despite the mounting difficulty, the king refused to cancel a single scheduled audience or appearance. His sense of duty to the role he had so meticulously cultivated, and perhaps his unwillingness to show weakness, kept him adhering to the daily routine as though nothing had changed. Courtiers continued to gather in the great salons, expecting to see the same radiant monarch they had always known. It was then that those closest to him began to notice changes that no amount of rouge or perfume could disguise. The once perfect posture of the Sunday king, straight-backed and exuding confidence, was now slightly stooped, a subtle bowing under the invisible weight of pain. His complexion, once carefully maintained to convey vitality, had grown pale, the makeup applied by his attendants unable to restore its former glow. Most troubling of all was an unfamiliar, faint odour that began to emanate from the king himself. At first it was only a slight, strange scent, detectable only to those who stood close to him, but it was persistent, lingering in the air in a way that even the most potent French perfumes could not entirely mask. It was not the fragrance of age or fatigue, but something deeper, a warning of the body's hidden decay. For the courtiers, trained to keep their expressions neutral, this change was difficult to ignore. In the mirrored halls and candlelit chambers of Versailles, where every detail of appearance was a calculated statement, these subtle signs hinted at a truth the king's public persona was not meant to reveal. The figure who had embodied the glory and endurance of the French monarchy for so long now bore, however faintly, the marks of human frailty, marks that no ceremony could conceal. Still, Louis the Fourteenth carried on, moving from one obligation to the next, his mind fixed on maintaining the dignity and grandeur of his reign. The rituals continued as they always had. The music played, the courtiers bowed, and the foreign envoys presented their petitions. But beneath the surface, the first cracks in the facade had appeared. Those who saw him daily understood that something was wrong, though none could yet imagine the true scale of the ordeal that was beginning to unfold. By mid-August, the condition of Louis the Fourteenth's left leg had taken a grave turn. The skin around the afflicted area had changed in appearance, darkening into irregular, mottled patches that could no longer be mistaken for a simple bruise. The discoloration deepened each day, spreading in uneven shapes that seemed to sink into the flesh itself. Alongside this visual change came an increasingly overpowering odor, heavy, foul, and unmistakably unnatural, that began to fill the air around him. The stench became so intense that some of the attendants quietly petitioned to be reassigned. Unable to endure long hours in the king's presence, those who remained did so out of loyalty or ambition, their expressions carefully schooled, though the strain showed in their eyes. At last, Guy Crescent Fagon, the chief physician who had always projected calm authority, was forced to admit that this was a medical crisis beyond his skill. Summoning additional doctors from within the court and the most reputable practitioners from Paris, he sought every possible opinion. Yet, one by one, these men examined the king and withdrew in frustration, their remedies no more effective than Fagon's own. They tried everything the medical orthodoxy of the time could offer, further bloodletting, in the hope of drawing out the supposed corrupt humours, replacing old herbal poultices with new combinations of leaves, roots, and oils, whispered prayers, and solemn blessings, even elaborate religious ceremonies intended to call upon divine mercy. None of it made the slightest difference. The king's strength waned visibly with each passing day, and his temper, once a carefully controlled display of royal gravitas, grew brittle under the constant assault of pain. By the end of August, the dreadful truth could no longer be disguised or softened with polite euphemisms. Louis the Fourteenth's leg was rotting while he still lived. The flesh was dying inch by inch, the process visible and unstoppable. Every morning, the king's guards were forced to tie scented cloths across their faces before approaching his bedchamber. The perfumed fabric, their only defense against the invasive stench. The leg itself, once a symbol of the monarch's vigor, the same leg that had carried him through stately dances, military reviews, and countless processions, had become an object of horror, blackened, slick with foul-smelling discharge, and visibly shrinking in form. It no longer seemed part of a living man's body. It was as though death itself had begun its work early, choosing one limb to devour, while leaving the rest of the king trapped in cruel awareness. Yet, in defiance of his condition, Louis refused to relinquish the daily rituals that had defined his reign. He continued to appear before his courtiers, to receive ambassadors, to preside over formal gatherings. Even as his body betrayed him, he would be dressed in the finest garments Versailles could provide, layers of silk and brocade carefully arranged to conceal his decline. The thick fabrics could not mask the smell, but they maintained the outward shape of a monarch who still held the title of Sunday King. Those nobles who once jostled and schemed for the honour of a place near his person now found themselves struggling to hide their revulsion. They bowed, they smiled, they murmured the prescribed compliments, all while willing themselves not to breathe too deeply. The air in the royal chambers was heavy and oppressive, scented with a sickly mixture of decaying flesh, incense, and the strongest perfumes France could produce. To stand in that room was to feel the tension between the image and the reality of power, a glittering court surrounding a man whose body was visibly failing, but whose will to maintain the illusion of majesty remained unbroken. Even as the physical collapse advanced, Louis the Fourteenth clung to the pageantry that had for more than 70 years, convinced the world that he was not merely a ruler, but a figure ordained to shine like the sun itself. Now, however, the light was dimming, and those who watched knew they were in the presence of both history and its inevitable end. The final days of August brought horrors. Even the hardened walls of Versailles could not contain. The necrosis spread with alarming speed, creeping beyond the confines of the king's left leg and beginning to touch other parts of his body. The stench that followed this decay no longer lingered in corners. It dominated the royal bedchamber, saturating every fold of fabric, every tapestry, every breath of air. Servants burned bundles of pungent herbs and sticks of incense, day and night, their smoke curling thickly through the corridors. Yet the odour still seeped outward. It was said one could detect it from 3 rooms away. Even the most steadfast courtiers, men and women who had built their lives around enduring the whims and rituals of royal service, began to falter. Excuses were made to avoid attending the king's morning audience. The lever? Some feigned illness. Others claimed pressing duties elsewhere in the palace. The truth was harder to admit. They feared the sight, and worse, the smell, of their monarch's decline. And yet Louis the Fourteenth refused to abandon the ceremony. Ash morning, the guards and attendants dressed him in the full regalia of state, layers of silk, embroidered waistcoats, the finest lace cuffs, the heavy sash and jewelled orders that had once dazzled the court. Their task was delicate, for they had to dress a body that was rotting in places, concealing it under brocade and gold thread, while ensuring no garment clung too tightly to the afflicted flesh. They moved with quiet precision, never meeting each other's eyes, as if their silence might help preserve what dignity could still be salvaged. The audiences themselves had grown shorter, and the number of petitioners had dwindled. Where once dozens had pressed forward for a chance to be seen by the Sun King, now only a small, hesitant handful entered the gilded chamber. Louis sat upon his chair of state, his face still composed in the practiced mask of royal authority, but his skin was pale and drawn. A faint tremor in his jaw betrayed the effort it took to endure both the physical agony and the slow erosion of his image. For those who did attend, the experience was unsettling to the point of nightmare. Here was the man they had been taught to regard as the very embodiment of divine order, a ruler appointed by God himself, the earthly reflection of heavenly perfection, and yet before their eyes, his body was succumbing to the same forces that claimed beggars and criminals. The rich perfumes of Versailles could not hide the truth. The Sun King was rotting, and no human or divine intervention seemed capable of stopping it. Some left the chamber shaken, unable to sleep that night. Others found their faith in the monarchy itself wavering. If God's chosen representative could decay in such a way, then what did that say about the sacred nature of royal power? The question, whispered in private corners and behind closed doors, carried a quiet but dangerous weight. By the first days of September, even Louis could no longer pretend otherwise. The pain had sharpened into something relentless and overwhelming. Every attempt to speak was punctuated by involuntary groans, the kind that tore at a man's pride as much as his body. Sitting for long periods was nearly impossible. Moving was torture. The smell had grown so unbearable that even he, long accustomed to the heavy scents of Versailles and the realities of illness, found himself gagging. There were moments when his own presence repulsed him. For perhaps the first time in his life, Louis the Fourteenth allowed himself to consider death seriously. Not the abstract, ceremonial death of a king, draped in velvet and surrounded by solemn prayers, but the real thing, death as a physical end, preceded by pain, weakness, and humiliation. He began to sense that his passing might not be the grand, dignified conclusion he had envisioned, but rather something raw, degrading, and deeply human. The thought was more unsettling than he had expected. This was a man who had ruled longer than most of his subjects had lived, who had moulded France in his image, and who had, for decades, succeeded in controlling the way the world saw him. Now, as the days shortened and the summer heat pressed heavily upon Versailles, he realized there were forces no ritual, no law, and no symbol could command. The Sun King might have bent men and nations to his will, but death was coming on its own terms, and it would not be swayed. Serving the king had now become a form of torment. One by one, members of the royal household petitioned to be reassigned to other duties, or claimed sudden illnesses that would excuse them from entering the royal chamber. Those who remained did so out of unshakable loyalty, or a sense of duty so ingrained it overrode their revulsion. Yet they paid a terrible price, day after day. They endured the stench of decaying flesh and the sight of a sovereign's body breaking down before their eyes. The necrosis, which had begun in the left leg, spread further. Patches of skin on other parts of his body turned black, mottled, and soft to the touch, then began to break down into a wet, foul-smelling rot. The sight alone was distressing, but it was the smell that seemed to assault the soul. The king's breath, once perfumed by the fine oils and meticulous dental care of the court, had soured into something unbearable, an odour so sharp and corrupt that holding a conversation with him was a physical challenge. Visitors who braved the chamber later confided that the air around the king felt poisoned, as if the corruption of his body seeped invisibly into the lungs of those nearby. The tapestries and carpets of Versailles, so long accustomed to holding the fragrance of incense and fine perfume, now seemed to drink in a far darker scent, one that no amount of smoke or flowers could erase. Faced with this accelerating decline, the royal physicians gathered in uneasy conference. Guy Crescent-Fagan and his fellow doctors reached the grim conclusion that there was only one possible intervention left: amputation of the left leg. It would be, even by the brutal standards of 17th century surgery, a catastrophic ordeal. Without anesthesia beyond strong drink or perhaps a rag soaked in vinegar, the king would endure unimaginable pain. The bleeding alone might kill him. And even if he survived the procedure, infection, the same invisible predator already consuming him, would almost certainly finish what the knife began. When they presented this option, they did so with the solemnity of men delivering a death sentence. Louis the Fourteenth listened without outward alarm, but the set of his jaw and the narrowing of his eyes betrayed his calculation. To lose a leg was to lose more than flesh and bone. It was to lose the image of himself as whole, unshakable, and divinely favoured. He rejected the proposal without hesitation. There would be no crude sawing of limbs, no spectacle of the sun, king screaming under the surgeon's hands. Instead, he placed what hope remained in the rituals of faith. Relics of saints were brought to Versailles and laid upon the wound, each arrival greeted with incense and solemn prayer. Clergy recited masses in the royal chapel. Candles burned through the night. The relics were pressed gently to the blackened flesh. Their presence meant to call down divine healing. Louis received these rites with the dignity of a king. Yet in the quiet moments afterward, when the chamber was empty, but for a handful of attendants, his gaze often turned inward. In the long hours between the visits of physicians and priests, he began to feel the fragility of his life in a way he had never allowed himself to before. For over 7 decades, he had lived under the unshaken belief that God had set him apart, not merely to rule, but to endure. Battles, assassinations, and epidemics had passed him by. Illnesses had yielded to treatment. Crises had been turned aside by the combined will of man and heaven. Now, however, as the blackness spread beneath his skin, and each breath carried the bitter taste of decay, that belief faltered. Mortality was no longer an abstraction for other men. It was here, in his own body, announcing itself with pain and odour, eroding not only his strength, but also the armour of divine certainty that had shielded him since youth. He said nothing of these doubts aloud. The Sun King still greeted his courtiers with the remnants of regal composure, still held his head high when the relics were placed upon him. still allowed the physicians to fuss over their treatments. But in the privacy of his mind, he could feel the truth pressing closer. There would be no turning back. The decay would not retreat. And sooner than he had ever imagined, he would have to meet death, not as a king surrounded by gold and ceremony, but as a man, stripped of all illusions, staring into the dark. In the depths of despair, Louis at last consented to consider the amputation his physicians had urged for many weeks. The decision was not born of hope so much as resignation. The pain, the odour, the unrelenting decay had driven him to a threshold he had once sworn never to cross. Yet when preparations began, the royal surgeons quickly realized the futility of their plan. The necrosis had advanced far beyond the confines of the left leg. Blackened, lifeless tissue had crept so high, and into so many regions of the body, that removing the limb would do nothing to halt the march of death. The king's flesh was surrendering from within. As his physical ruin deepened, a more troubling transformation took hold of his mind. Those who remained in attendance, few though they were, began whispering of strange, chilling occurrences. Louis spoke aloud to people, long dead, addressing uncles and cousins, ministers and generals, as if they were standing at the foot of his bed. His tone was not that of a man reminiscing, but of one in active conversation. Sometimes he would pause mid-sentence to listen, eyes fixed on a point no one else could see. Before responding with solemn nods or sharp commands, he began issuing orders to invisible attendants, instructing them to fetch items or convey messages, and answering questions that no living mouth had posed. The effect on the chamber was unnerving. Combined with the stifling miasma of decay that clung to the draperies and hung heavy in the air, this new habit turned the royal apartments into something like a haunted cell, where the living moved uneasily in the company of the unseen. Religion, always the cornerstone of his reign, now cast an even more complicated shadow over the scene. For more than 70 years, Louis had been the son, king not merely in name but in the divine narrative he embodied, the ruler chosen by God, the earthly image of celestial order. Versailles itself had been constructed as a stage for that sanctified drama, its rituals and processions reinforcing the belief that the monarch's authority flowed directly from heaven. Now, as his body rotted while he still breathed, the symbolism twisted into something darker. Among courtiers and clergy alike, the question began to surface quietly, behind closed doors, whether this was not a trial from God, but a punishment. The wars waged in the king's name, the crushing of dissent, the lavish expenditures that strained the realm's coffers, had they all accumulated into a moral debt now being collected in flesh? Some saw in his suffering the mirror of Old Testament judgment, a sovereign brought low so that the sins of the court might be laid bare. This was not a thought that could be voiced openly, yet it hung in the minds of many who came to pay their respects and left with the scent of death in their clothes. The royal confessor, charged with the impossible task of tending both to the king's soul and to the fragile illusion of unbroken divine favour, found himself in a perilous position. His duty was to comfort the monarch, to assure him that his suffering had purpose, that it was not evidence of God's wrath. At the same time, he had to protect the faith of those who looked upon the king as the living axis of France. Each visit to the royal chamber became a balancing act. The confessor would kneel by the bed, speaking in soft, deliberate tones, guiding the king toward prayers for strength and forgiveness. Yet he could not ignore the fever-bright eyes that sometimes slid past him, focusing instead on figures only the king could see. When Louis murmured replies to his long-dead mother, or to a marshal who had fallen in battle decades before, the priest's voice would falter for a heartbeat before continuing. Outside the bedchamber, the palace corridors were thick with rumours. Some swore the king had been seen reaching out into empty air, as though grasping the hand of a ghost. Others claimed that, late at night, muffled conversations could be heard through the doors, one voice living, the others belonging to those whose bodies lay long in the crypts of Saint-Denis. The fear was not merely of death, but of what such visions implied. If the son, King's mind, wandered into the realm of the dead before his body followed, was he already slipping from the earthly authority that had defined him? For Louis himself, there was no public acknowledgement of this new, spectral court he seemed to entertain. But the evidence was inescapable. The conversations with the unseen, the orders to those not present, the sudden, vacant pauses. These moments revealed a man whose grip on the present was weakening, and with each passing day, as the confessor bent over the bed in his mission to preserve both the king's faith and the aura of divine right, it became harder to tell whether either could survive the slow, unholy unraveling of the Sun King. By the time September arrived, Louis's physical condition declined at a pace that outstripped even the grimmest predictions of his physicians. The necrosis, once confined to his lower limbs, now spread with dreadful speed to other parts of his body. Each day brought new symptoms, fresh humiliations that further eroded the grandeur he had so carefully cultivated for more than 7 decades. Teeth loosened and fell one by one, leaving gaps that distorted his speech. His skin, once powdered to a golden glow, dulled to the ashen grey of cooling embers, a shade that no amount of rouge or rice powder could conceal. Beneath the silk and lace, his internal organs began to falter, producing both odours and physical manifestations so foul that even the most battle-hardened attendants struggled to remain in the room. Serving a monarch who was, quite literally, decomposing in life, while still upholding the rigid ceremonial of the court, became an ordeal that blurred the line between farce and tragedy. Every morning, the bedding had to be changed several times a day, as fluids seeped from his body, evidence of the disease's relentless progress. Yet even this act of hygiene was shackled to the elaborate etiquette of Versailles. The linen, made from the finest, most delicate cloth, was difficult to launder, and the process of changing it required multiple witnesses to observe each step. Chamberlains and valets, their faces stiff with forced composure, lifted and turned the king with the same reverence they would have shown when his body was whole. Even as the scent of rot rose from the mattress like a physical presence, meals, once a brilliant display of abundance and refinement, now descended into macabre theatre. The royal table was still laid out with gleaming silver, ornate porcelain, and platters of delicacies from every corner of the realm. For to do otherwise would be to admit the crumbling reality. Yet the man at the head of that table could no longer partake in the rituals of dining. The rot within his mouth made chewing impossible. The very act of opening his jaw released an odour so sharp and rancid it could turn the stomach. Solid food was out of the question. Instead, attendants prepared nutrient-rich liquids, which he consumed through a slender tube. Even so, the ceremonies of mealtime remained intact. Courtiers took their places as if attending a royal feast. They bowed, smiled, and murmured polite conversation, pretending they were part of an elegant repast, rather than witnesses to a living corpse sipping broth in strained silence. Every tilt of the cup, every movement of the straw, was observed and acknowledged as though it were the carving of a roast or the tasting of a fine wine. The contrast between the grandeur of the ritual and the grotesque reality of the scene was almost unbearable. In the great halls of Versailles, the sun, king, had long been the centre of gravity, a living symbol of France's glory and divine order. Now, that same symbol sat cloaked in brocade, surrounded by the trappings of majesty. While the physical truth beneath was one of putrefaction and fragility, the room smelled of a mixture of perfume, decaying flesh, and the herbal smoke burned in desperate attempts to mask the stench. Courtiers dabbed scented handkerchiefs to their noses, careful to do so discreetly, for open disgust could be read as an act of disloyalty. It was a pageant that fooled no one, yet all played their parts. The king himself, though racked by pain and exhaustion, clung to the routines of ceremony as if they were the last threads tethering him to the world of the living. Every gesture, the slight incline of his head in acknowledgement, the formal acceptance of a dish he would never eat, was performed with the stubborn dignity of a man refusing to concede defeat to decay. Behind closed doors, however, the palace was a hive of whispered conversations. Those who served in the bedchamber spoke of the strain of keeping their expressions neutral while changing the linens for the third or fourth time in a single day. The laundry staff groaned under the impossible task of cleaning fine fabrics, saturated with fluids no soap could fully remove. The kitchen, once a place of creative pride, now measured success by the smoothness of a broth and the precision with which it could be poured into a vessel small enough to fit discreetly under the king's lips. What made the ordeal most haunting was the collective pretense. This was no longer simply the king's decline. It was a shared performance in which the entire court became actors in a cruel comedy. They maintained the illusion that this was still a reign of power and splendor, when in truth it had become a slow, ceremonial vigil for a man whose body was surrendering, piece by piece, to death. And yet, for all its horror, the spectacle carried a strange, grim grandeur. The Sun King, still orbiting at the center of his universe, refusing to let the darkness claim his stage before the final curtain fell. The psychological toll on the servants and ladies in waiting was immeasurable. Many had spent decades within the gilded walls of Versailles, devoted to the belief that they were serving a divinely appointed sovereign. Now, they were forced to watch as that same figure, once the embodiment of majesty, was stripped of all splendor, reduced to little more than a rotting shell. The contrast between the image they had upheld for so long and the reality before them was unbearable. It was as if the very heart of the monarchy had been exposed, raw and vulnerable, for all to see. By the middle of September, it was clear that Louis had entered the final stage. His moments of lucidity became shorter and less frequent, like the last flickers of a candle running out of wax. Yet, in those rare intervals when consciousness returned, the king insisted on performing a shortened version of the daily rituals that had once defined his reign. Even as his body failed him, he clung to ceremony, as if each bow, each formal gesture, could somehow stave off the inevitable. The sight was nothing short of surreal, a sovereign whose flesh was disintegrating, yet still summoning the will to sit upright on the throne. His eyes dulled but resolute. It was an image that burned itself into the memory of all who survived those days. Courtiers who had once witnessed grand processions and glittering fetes now stood silently in rooms heavy with the scent of death, watching their monarch fight to preserve the only identity he had ever known. For the physicians, desperation had become the guiding principle. Every known remedy of the age had already been exhausted: herbal poultices, aromatic fumigations, and endless prayers had all failed to halt the decay. In their place came strange and unsettling experiments, each more outlandish than the last. Animal parts were pressed against the king's wounds, based on the belief that the life force of the beast might transfer into the royal flesh. Slabs of freshly slaughtered meat were tied against the blackened skin, the warmth quickly giving way to the cold inevitability of infection. At times, the chamber filled with the thick, metallic smell of blood mingled with the sour stench of rot. Cauterization, their tips glowing red, were applied directly to the diseased tissue. The theory was that the searing heat might cauterize the spread, but in practice, it only unleashed screams so piercing they carried through the marble corridors, chilling all who heard them. Some witnesses swore that the echoes of his cries could be felt more than heard, a vibration in the bones that stayed long after the sound faded. Perhaps the most grotesque measure of all involved wrapping the king's legs in the still warm hide of a freshly killed animal. The belief was that the heat, the essence of a living creature, might coax the dying flesh back to life. Servants carried in the steaming skins, their eyes fixed on the floor to avoid meeting the gaze of the onlookers. The hide clung to the limb like a macabre second skin, the smell of raw animal mingling with the already unbearable air. Through it all, the court maintained the facade of order. Each bizarre procedure was accompanied by the same protocols that would have surrounded a triumphal public appearance. Titles were spoken, bows exchanged, and movements choreographed as though this were not an improvised struggle against death, but another chapter in the grand performance of kingship. For the attendants, every day was a battle to contain their own horror. They were expected to show no sign of revulsion, no tremor in the voice, no flicker of doubt in their expression. They dressed his wounds and changed his linens with the same precision they would have brought to arranging the folds of his ceremonial robes. Yet behind the closed doors of the servants' quarters, whispers of dread passed from one to another. Some feared they were witnessing divine retribution, a punishment for the wars, the vanity, and the relentless taxation that had marked his rule. Others saw only the fragility of the human body, a reminder that even the Sun King could not command the laws of flesh and time. All agreed on one thing: the memory of those final weeks would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the end, the struggle became less about saving the king's life and more about preserving the illusion of control. The physicians clung to their outlandish treatments not because they believed they would work, but because doing nothing was unthinkable. The courtiers upheld the rituals not because they expected the king to recover, but because abandoning them would mean admitting the reign was over before the man himself had drawn his last breath. And so the strange theatre continued, part tragedy, part devotion. The part denial until it seemed the entire palace was suspended between life and death, between the grandeur of the past and the shadow of the inevitable. The royal family, already diminished by years of loss and exile, found themselves in an excruciating dilemma. They were bound by duty to uphold their public roles, to embody stability and grandeur, while privately bearing witness to the daily disintegration of the man who stood at the head of their dynasty. The spectacle was not merely one of illness, it was a prolonged erosion of the monarch's body and mind, played out under the unyielding gaze of both the court and the world beyond Versailles. The future Louis the XV, then only 5 years old, was shielded from the worst of it. He was kept far from the sick room, his days carefully arranged to prevent any accidental encounter with the ghastly reality of his great-grandfather's decline. Yet other family members were not spared. They were compelled to attend the rituals, to sit through audiences, to smile faintly, and exchange pleasantries. Even as the scent of decay clung to their clothes, and the echo of the king's groans followed them down the corridors. The strain was not limited to the family alone. The court's diplomatic machinery began to falter under the weight of the situation. Ambassadors who came to Versailles, expecting the commanding presence of the Sun King, were instead ushered into a dim, too oppressive chamber, where a withering monarch struggled to maintain coherence. His mind, once sharp and relentless, wandered without warning at times, lucid, at times adrift in a haze of confusion. For many envoys, the encounter was so disquieting that their missions were quietly postponed or cancelled altogether. Treaties, negotiations, and alliances that might have been sealed with a confident handshake were left hanging in uncertainty. The news, carried discreetly across borders, began to stir unease among neighbouring nations. Rumours spread that France's centre of gravity was shifting, that the inevitable death of Louis would bring not just mourning, but a political storm capable of destabilising the continent. Meanwhile, Versailles itself seemed to shrink under the weight of the final week. The king's body had reached a state of deterioration so extreme that even the most loyal attendants found it difficult to remain in his presence. The stench of death seeped into the walls, saturating an entire wing of the palace. Servants carried perfumed cloths pressed to their noses, yet the heavy, sweetly putrid air clung to them long after they left the chamber. Those moments when the king regained clarity were perhaps the most harrowing of all. Louis was fully aware of the horror his body had become. He understood the repulsion in the eyes of those around him, even if court etiquette prevented them from speaking it aloud. In those lucid intervals, his voice would drop to a hoarse whisper, pleading with his physicians to end the torment. He consented to the idea of amputation once unthinkable for a monarch grasping at any chance, however slim, to halt the spread of decay. Yet by then, the disease had already advanced beyond the reach of such measures. When told there was nothing more to be done, he shifted his requests to stronger doses of pain relief. But in an age where the science of anesthesia and analgesia was rudimentary at best, even the most potent mixtures could only dull the edges of his agony, never erase it. The doctors, faced with their own impotence, turned increasingly to prayer. They stood at his bedside murmuring invocations, their eyes fixed not on the patient, but on the crucifix at the foot of the bed. The atmosphere in the chamber became one of suspended desperation, an endless cycle of whispered supplications and shallow breaths, of ritual and resignation. Outside those oppressive walls, the rest of the palace moved in a strained imitation of normalcy. Musicians still played in the salons, courtiers still engaged in careful gossip, and the fountains in the gardens still danced in the sunlight. Yet everyone knew the rhythm was hollow. The heart of Versailles was failing, and the echo of its pulse was growing fainter by the hour. In the end, the royal family's ordeal was one of endurance. They could not intervene, could not hasten the end, could not alter the course of decay. All they could do was hold their composure before the court, hide their grief behind masks of dignity, and wait for the moment when the long agony would finally give way to silence. For the Sun King, that moment was drawing ever closer, inevitable, unstoppable, and heavy with the knowledge that his last days would be remembered not for splendor, but for the slow, public unraveling of both flesh and majesty. In the final days, the religious ceremonies around the king became relentless, tinged with a kind of desperation that even the most stoic could not ignore. The royal chaplain, his voice solemn yet strained, sought to frame the suffering as a divine trial, a purification of the soul before meeting God. He spoke of heavenly rewards and the grace found in endurance. Yet even the most devout in attendance felt an inner conflict. The sight before them, a monarch reduced to a decaying shell, clashed violently with the idea of holy refinement. Holy relics were brought from every corner of France. Some carried in ornate reliquaries, others wrapped in worn linen, all placed reverently around the king's bed. Each object was said to hold miraculous power: a fragment of a saint's bone, a vial of oil from a sacred shrine, a rosary blessed by a revered bishop. The chamber became crowded with these tokens of faith, their presence meant to push back the shadow of death. Outside the king's private apartments, religious communities took turns in continuous prayer. Monks, nuns, and priests rotated in shifts through the long nights and weary days, their chants rising and falling in a solemn rhythm. The corridors echoed with murmured litanies, the air thick with incense meant to mask the smell that no human effort could truly contain. Even so, the odour of decay persisted, weaving itself into the very fabric of the palace. Yet, despite the prayers, relics, and constant invocations, Louis the Fourteenth's physical torment did not lessen. His pain remained sharp, unyielding, and the process of decomposition moved forward without pause. The swelling in his limbs worsened, the sores deepened, and his breathing became a laboured, uneven struggle. There was no moment of respite, no gentle turn toward peace, only the slow march toward the inevitable. In the early hours of September, the first, in the year 1715, the first pale light of dawn slipped through the tall windows of Versailles. The faint golden glow fell across the royal bed, touching the motionless figure that had once commanded a continent. Witnesses recalled how, in those final minutes, there was no regal speech, no dramatic farewell, only the weakening sound of breath, each one shallower than the last. Then, with a final exhalation, The Sun King's reign came to its end. It was not the serene passing of a beloved ruler surrounded by peaceful reverence, but rather a release from relentless agony. One onlooker described it not as a farewell sigh, but as a long breath of relief, as though the king himself welcomed the end after so many months of suffering. There was no denying that death had brought him freedom from a torment that had stripped away not only his health but his dignity. And yet, even in death, the horror did not immediately cease. The body, already so far into the process of decay, began to change more rapidly. Now that the frail pulse was gone, the air in the chamber thickened, attendants shifted uneasily. Caught between their duty to remain and the overpowering urge to leave, ritual demanded they stay, that they continue to treat the remains with all the dignity due to a monarch. But no protocol could soften the reality of what lay before them. The priests continued their prayers, voices faltering only slightly as they struggled to focus on the soul's journey rather than the grim spectacle of the flesh left behind. Courtiers stood rigid, their faces carefully composed, though their eyes betrayed a deep unease. The death of Louis the Fourteenth marked the end of an era, yet it also left behind an image few could forget: the once glorious Sun King, diminished to a lifeless body that bore the marks of months of unrelenting decay. Beyond the chamber, the news began to ripple outward. Messengers were dispatched, bells tolled in measured strokes, and across France, word spread that the longest reign in the nation's history had come to a close. But in the heart of Versailles, in that suffocating room where faith, duty, and reality collided, the weight of the moment was not one of triumphant legacy, it was one of grim relief, heavy with the knowledge that the suffering was finally over. But the memory of it would haunt all who had borne witness. The state of Louis's body had deteriorated to such an extreme that the traditional royal embalming procedures became utterly impossible. When the embalmers began their work, opening the abdominal cavity as custom required, they were met with a sight that turned their faces as pale as the marble floors beneath their feet. Many of the king's internal organs had completely liquefied, reduced to a dark, foul-smelling slurry that no skill or ritual could redeem. The intestines, which by tradition were to be removed, treated, and preserved separately in ornate reliquaries, had lost all recognizable structure. They now existed only as a shapeless, putrid mass. The workmen had to scoop it out by hand, their fingers sinking into the warm, decayed matter. Each movement released waves of stench so overpowering that the air in the chamber seemed to thicken. Several attendants collapsed where they stood, overcome by nausea and the sheer violence of the odour. The heart, long regarded as a sacred relic of the monarch, destined to be enshrined in a place of honour, proved no better. When lifted from the chest cavity, it was found partially decomposed, the flesh blackened and crumbling at the slightest touch. Instead of the noble, enduring symbol it was meant to be, it had become a grim testament to the extent of the king's decay. Pieces broke away as it was handled, forcing the embalmers to abandon hopes of preserving it in any meaningful form. They laboured through the night, determined to do what little they could to create a body fit for public display during the funeral rites. Layers of linen were wrapped tightly around the corpse, aromatic resins and powders applied in heavy doses. Yet each attempt to mask the smell failed within minutes. The fluids that continued to seep from the body soaked through the wrappings, staining them with dark, spreading blotches. The final indignity came when the time came to place the king into the elaborate coffin that had been prepared weeks before. It was a masterpiece of royal craftsmanship, gilded, lined with rich fabrics, and designed to cradle the king's body in a final display of majesty. But the corpse had swollen grotesquely in the days since death. The limbs and torso puffed and misshapen from the gases of decomposition. The attendants tried shifting his position, compressing the wrappings, even adjusting the angle of the limbs, but the body would not fit. In the end, They were forced to strip away the layers of padding inside the coffin, removing the fine cushions and embroidered linings that had been intended to honor him in death. Even with these measures, it was a struggle to close the lid. When at last the coffin was sealed, it was done with haste, and heavy nails were driven in quickly to secure it not for ceremonial grandeur, but to trap within it the suffocating gases of decay that threatened to escape. The sealing was accompanied by an unspoken sense of relief. Those who had endured the embalming knew that, from that moment onward, the horrors of tending to the sun, king's remains would be hidden from public view. Yet the memory of those long, foul hours, the liquefied organs, the blackened heart, the stench that clung to skin and hair would linger with them for the rest of their lives. A private and unshakable reminder of how even the most absolute monarch is brought low by the hand of mortality. The funeral of Louis the Fourteenth was staged as one of the most magnificent ceremonies in the history of France, designed not only to honor the memory of the Sunday king, but also to reinforce the legitimacy of his successor. Every element was orchestrated with the grandeur befitting a monarch who had reigned for more than 7 decades. The procession stretched for miles, a living river of black and gold, winding from Versailles to the royal necropolis at Saint-Denis. Nobles in their finest mourning attire rode in gilded carriages. Foreign ambassadors in resplendent uniforms marched in solemn lines, and common citizens crowded the streets, eager to witness history's turning page. The air trembled with the deep, slow tolling of bells from every steeple along the route. Musicians played stately dirges, their notes swelling and falling like the breathing of a grieving nation. Banners embroidered with the royal sun emblem rippled in the breeze, and the streets were lined with torches, despite the daylight, casting flickering shadows on the faces of the mourners. Elaborate floral arrangements were carried before the coffin, filling the air with scents of lilies, roses, and fresh pine. Yet for those walking close to the hearse, the beauty was undercut by a truth too pungent to ignore. Beneath the layers of incense and the lavish sprinkling of perfume, the unmistakable odor of decay persisted. It was faint at first, a sour undercurrent in the otherwise fragrant air. But as the procession advanced and the day warmed, it grew sharper, more intrusive. The coffin, though sealed, could not fully contain the gases and seepage of a body that had been so grievously compromised before burial. The pallbearers' men chosen for strength, loyalty, and ceremonial presence found themselves battling waves of nausea. A few turned pale, their lips pressing into thin lines, as they fought to maintain composure before the thousands watching. At intervals, they shifted their grips, less from fatigue than from the need to steady themselves against the rising sickness. Inside the Cathedral of Saint-Denis, the magnificence continued. The nave glowed with candlelight reflected in gilded fixtures, and the vaulted ceiling echoed with the chanting of priests. Every word of the funeral mass was designed to elevate Louis to near-mythic status, portraying his reign as an unbroken chain of glory and divine favor. But those who stood closest to the coffin priests, attendants, and the king's household felt the pull of reality. The priests read the liturgy at a noticeably brisker pace, careful not to inhale too deeply, their voices occasionally wavering under the strain. When the time came to lower the coffin into the crypt, a momentary hush fell over the gathered crowd. There was more than grief in the silence. There was apprehension. The embalmers had warned of the pressure building inside the sealed casket, the possibility that the accumulated gases could rupture the wood with violent force. To prevent such a disaster, the royal tomb had been prepared differently from tradition. Ventilation channels had been discreetly opened to the outside air, and the work of sealing the crypt would be done swiftly, without the prolonged ceremonial pauses usually observed. As the coffin was lowered into its final resting place, the workers moved with controlled urgency. The ropes creaked, the polished wood descended, and a faint, unpleasant exhalation escaped into the air. It was quickly overpowered by the smoke of burning incense. But those close by exchanged subtle glances. They had heard the sigh of decomposition's final protest. The stone slab was pulled into position with a grinding sound, then sealed with mortar, while the choir sang a triumphant hymn. From the pews, the scene was one of unshakable dignity, the end of an era crowned by the timeless ritual of royal burial. Yet for those in the inner circle, the memory of the day would forever be tinged with unease, a reminder that even the most radiant monarch cannot escape the shadows of mortality, and that beneath the gold, silk, and music, the Sun King's final journey was marked not only by splendor, but by the inescapable scent of the grave. News of Louis the Fourteenth's death and the ghastly details surrounding it spread rapidly across Europe, shattering the flawless image he had so carefully cultivated over more than 7 decades. Official diplomatic dispatches retained the required tone of solemn respect, acknowledging the passing of a great monarch and offering condolences to the French court. But in the private correspondence exchanged between royal households, the language was strikingly different. These letters, often penned by trusted envoys or confidants, described in vivid, unsettling detail the scenes of decomposition witnessed at Versailles and Saint-Denis. The descriptions were both repulsive and magnetic, drawing the eyes of readers even as they recoiled. Courtiers in Vienna whispered about the unbearable stench that had clung to the funeral procession. In Madrid, reports spoke of the bloated coffin and the hurried rites to prevent an explosion. In London, some nobles took the opportunity to make sly comparisons between the mortal end of France's Sun King and the supposedly more dignified deaths of their own sovereigns. These letters, often sealed with urgency, travelled quickly, each one adding to the growing catalogue of macabre impressions. For the French people, the moment was more than just the death of a monarch. It was the unmistakable end of an era. For decades, Louis the Fourteenth had embodied the idea of an unshakable, near-divine kingship. His likeness adorned every corner of the realm. His words shaped the rhythms of court and country, and his presence at Versailles had come to feel eternal. Yet now, in the wake of his demise, the image of immortality was stripped away, revealing the same frailties that plagued all mortals. The very body that had stood as a symbol of absolute authority was reduced to a cautionary reminder of the limits of human flesh. In the public imagination, this was a rupture. The belief in the sacred and inviolable power of the monarchy, long reinforced by ritual, ceremony, and propaganda, wavered. If the Sun King could rot and smell like any common man, could he truly have been chosen by divine will? This unspoken doubt lingered, quietly eroding the ideological foundation of absolute rule. Pamphlets and satirical verses circulating discreetly at first hinted that perhaps such concentrated power belonged not in the hands of one man, but in a system that could protect the realm from the failings of a single mortal. Within scholarly and medical circles, the king's death ignited fierce debate. Physicians across Europe analysed every available report of his final illness, seeking to identify the root cause. Was it gangrene, septicemia, diabetes, or a combination of ailments exacerbated by age and neglect? Many questioned the methods employed by the royal doctors, methods grounded more in tradition and ceremonial authority than in emerging scientific understanding. Some argued that the king's physicians had been too bound by the rituals of court medicine, the endless consultations, the reluctance to contradict precedent, the preference for symbolic remedies over practical ones. Others pointed to the larger culture of Versailles, where maintaining the appearance of vitality was often more important than addressing the reality of decline. Bleeding, purging, and the application of poultices steeped in superstition may have satisfied the expectations of the court, but they did little to halt the relentless advance of disease. In universities from Leiden to Bologna, medical lecturers used the case of Louis the Fourteenth as a cautionary tale. They told their students that clinging to outdated treatments out of loyalty to royal image could lead to preventable suffering. Meanwhile, More progressive physicians saw the king's death as proof that medicine must break free from the chains of courtly tradition and embrace empirical, evidence-based methods. Beyond the scholarly debates, the ordinary people of France processed the news in ways that blended grief, awe, and a quiet sense of reckoning. In the taverns of Paris, voices lowered as drinkers shared the more sensational accounts smuggled in from the palace. In the rural provinces, priests framed the event in sermons as a reminder that no man, however exalted, could escape God's judgment. Mothers told their children stories of the sun, king's splendor, and his sad end, crafting a narrative that was part cautionary tale, part fading legend. In the years that followed, the image of Louis the Fourteenth would remain monumental in art and architecture. The gilded halls of Versailles, the sweeping gardens, the portraits bathed in golden light. Yet those who had lived through his final months would never forget the contrast between the radiance of his reign and the shadow that fell over its closing chapter. The man who had sought to define the very meaning of kingship left behind not only a political legacy, but also a haunting reminder that the glory of power is fleeting, and the body of even the mightiest ruler is bound to decay. Those servants and courtiers who had witnessed the final weeks of Louis the Fourteenth's life carried the memory as a private burden until their own deaths. Some avoided speaking of it altogether, as if words might reawaken the sights and smells that had haunted their dreams. Others, in whispered confessions to trusted friends, admitted that no matter how much time passed, they could not forget the sight of the king's once majestic frame succumbing to rot, or the sound of laboured breathing echoing in the night. For them, Versailles was no longer merely a palace of grandeur. It was a place that had been touched irreversibly by decay. In the months following the funeral, parts of the palace were discreetly renovated, draperies were replaced, floorboards were scrubbed or removed, and rooms were redecorated in an effort to erase the physical traces of those harrowing days. Yet, despite these changes, many insisted that a faint, indefinable odour lingered in certain chambers, an odour they called the royal scent of death. It was as if the stone walls themselves had absorbed the final chapter of the son, king's life, storing it in their pores, releasing it in moments of still air. The political climate of France also shifted. No successor would ever wield the same unchallenged authority as Louis the Fourteenth had commanded. His death marked a turning point, a moment when the illusion of an untouchable, divinely ordained monarch dissolved into the reality of mortality. Even the most ceremonial expressions of loyalty could no longer fully mask the truth. A king, no matter how exalted, was subject to the same frailties as those he ruled. Philosophically, his passing stirred questions that could not be easily dismissed. If a man believed to be chosen by God could meet such a grim and undignified end, what did that imply about the divine nature of his power? In salons and universities, these thoughts were explored cautiously, often wrapped in layers of metaphor to avoid accusations of blasphemy. Thinkers pondered whether political authority might derive less from heaven and more from the consent and scrutiny of the people. The tragedy of the Sun King's death had, in its own way, planted seeds of doubt about the very foundations of absolute monarchy. From a medical perspective, the detailed records kept by royal physicians during his final illness became a valuable resource for future generations. Later advancements in anatomy and pathology would revisit these notes, identifying clear signs of gangrene, septicemia, and advanced infection. The case provided a rare, documented example of late-stage necrosis in a high-profile patient, prompting debates about surgical intervention, antiseptics, and the dangers of clinging to ceremonial medical practices over empirical treatment. In time, these discussions contributed to a broader understanding of infection control and the importance of timely, practical intervention lessons that would save countless lives in the centuries to come. Culturally, the image of the Sun King's body in decay left an indelible mark on the European imagination. Artists, writers, and moralists alike found in it a potent symbol: the fragility of power, the inevitability of decline, and the futility of earthly glory. In sermons, preachers contrasted the splendor of Versailles with the final reality of its ruler's fate, reminding congregations that all crowns eventually fall before the same grave. In political satire, pamphleteers wielded the king's end as a metaphor for the overreach of human ambition, warning that grandeur without humility could only lead to ruin. Even in the decorative arts, subtle references appeared. Certain allegorical paintings of the 18th century, depicting rotting fruit or fading sunlight, were understood by contemporary viewers as allusions to the last days of Louis the Fourteenth's. His name, once synonymous with magnificence, became equally tied to the warning that no mortal, however gilded, could escape the slow hand of decay. Ultimately, the greatest legacy Louis the Fourteenth left behind was not the vast palace of Versailles, the military triumphs, or the carefully crafted image of a monarch at the center of the universe. It was the stark reminder that death is the one absolute equalizer. In the end, neither divine right nor imperial reach could spare him from the fate that binds all humanity. For those who had seen him at the height of his power commanding armies, dictating the terms of Europe's politics, dazzling courts with his presence, it was almost inconceivable to reconcile that memory with the body they had last seen, swollen and discolored, sealed quickly into its coffin. Yet, perhaps it was precisely in that contrast that the lesson lay. The Sun King's final gift to history was unintentional, but enduring. The understanding that no matter how vast one's dominion, how brilliant one's reign, or how elaborate one's myth, the end strips away every pretense. What remains is not the illusion of immortality, but the truth that all are bound to the same earth, and that the measure of a life lies not in its trappings, but in the humanity that endures beyond it. As we close this journey into the final days of Louis the Fourteenth, the Sun King whose reign defined an era, we are left with a story far more human than the gilded portraits and marble statues suggest. Beneath the gold-threaded robes, beyond the endless halls of Versailles, there was a man subject to the same frailties, fears, and inevitable end as every soul who has walked this earth. His life was a masterpiece of grandeur, yet his death was a stark reminder that no crown, no matter how heavy with jewels, can shield its wearer from mortality. This video is not merely about the decay of a king's body. It is about the unmasking of power. It reveals how even the strongest walls, whether of stone, ceremony, or divine image, cannot hold back the truth. Power can awe, inspire, and shape the course of nations, but it cannot halt the silent, patient march of time. And when time calls, all titles, all victories, and all riches fade into the same silence. The value of this story lies in its honesty. It strips away the illusion that greatness is measured solely in outward splendor. Through the harrowing details of Louis the Fourteenth's final days, we learn that leadership, legacy, and life itself are defined not only by what is built in the light of day, but also by how we face the darkness that inevitably comes. It reminds us to see through the veneer, to question the myths we are told, and to understand that humanity, not perfection, is what binds us together. For the audience, the lesson is clear. Respect the fragility of life, and treasure the time given to you. Do not be deceived by the false permanence of power, beauty, or fame. Instead, invest in what outlasts them: kindness, compassion, and truth. History's most valuable gift is not the spectacle of kings and empires, but the warning that glory without humility is as fleeting as sunlight at dusk. Through the lens of Louis the Fourteenth's story, we also see the value of curiosity and reflection. The past is not just a collection of dates and events, It is a mirror, showing us both the heights humanity can reach and the depths to which it can fall. In seeing the sun, king's decline, we are reminded that no one stands above the laws of nature, and that our worth is measured by the humanity we preserve, not the illusions we project. And now, as the echoes of Versailles fade into the quiet of the night, I invite you to close your eyes and let the lessons settle. May they remind you, in your waking hours, to live with purpose and humility, and in your dreams, to walk freely in a world where power serves compassion, not ego. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. May you have a peaceful night, filled with gentle dreams, and if you wish to continue exploring the most captivating and meaningful stories from the past, do not forget to subscribe to our channel so you will not miss the new and unforgettable tales we have yet to share. Sleep well, and until next time, good night.